New Zealand is not a small country, but a large village. Peter Jackson. New Zealand is one of the most iconic yet simultaneously overlooked nations. I recall playing the strategy board game Risk as a child, and I noticed that the map at the time didn't even include New Zealand. It's a shame because New Zealand punches well above its weight. Its population is only around 5 million, and is found in one of the most obscure corners on the planet, yet unlike many Pacific Island nations, it's a household name. How many of you have ever heard of Tuvalu, for example? This is one of the most wealthy and stable nations on the planet. However, it's oftentimes overlooked due to its isolation, small population, quiet demeanor, especially in regards to their Australian neighbors.
I had with me undies on and I've walked out the front and I've seen the car smashed and I've seen the bloke walking back to the car, and so I've walked outside and I said, "Oh, what are you doing, mate? Like, you can't be leaving the scene." And he goes, "Don't be a hero, mate." And I said, "I'm not trying to be a hero, but the police are coming." And he just decided he'd scoot up the road, and I just said, "Nah, it's not going on like that, mate."
They tend to be ignored in the realm of geopolitics. Well, I won't ignore them. And having visited the country a few years ago, I'd like to bring attention to this overlooked country, often only referenced for Lord of the Rings memes and sheep. Let's start off with the landmass. New Zealand's most well-known feature, its isolation. Perhaps no other well-known part of the world is more well-known for being far away from everything else and everyone else. Except for possibly Hawaii, which isn't even a country, but is another Pacific Polynesian island region with deep connections to New Zealand. If anything, New Zealand is kind of like a more British version of Hawaii with a temperate rather than tropical climate. New Zealand is composed of two main islands, originally named the North and South Island. Come on guys, you can do better than that. There are a few others, such as Stewart Island, south of the South Island, which has even made a mock cause of wanting independence, which I love, and this is very typical of New Zealand, just a lot of lighthearted humor. Both islands are part of a far more massive continental shelf, most of which is submerged at this point in Earth's history. The two islands have very different landscapes though, with the north being warmer, with massive fern tree forests that make you think you're walking through Jurassic Park. The south is cooler, and is home to the Southern Alps, a region resembling the mountain range in Switzerland, along the western spine of that island, along with golden fields across the eastern plains, making the country perfect for pastures. On the North Island lies the largest city, Auckland, the city of sails, located in a fascinating topological region where nearly every part of the city is located within a decent walking distance from the ocean. The capital, Wellington, is located on the North Island as well, but on its southern peninsula, acting as a unifying center, although perhaps not the best place since it's not too far from tectonic fault lines. This leads us to another aspect of New Zealand's geography, its tectonic activity. As a country being composed of volcanic islands in the Pacific Ring of Fire, is prone to devastating earthquakes. This was most notable during the early 2010s when an earthquake and aftershock hit the Southern Island's largest city, Christchurch. The South Island, while bigger, hosts a smaller population today, spurred in part due to the aforementioned earthquake. However, historically it had a larger population, and is a major center of agriculture and tourism. Some people say that the South Island of New Zealand is so beautiful it looks fake. No wonder they filmed so many films here. Moving on to history, New Zealand is a young nation. Unlike Australia, which is also a young nation in the civic western sense, but has a very long anthropological history with Aboriginals dating back thousands of years ago, in some cases even older than certain parts of Europe, New Zealand was actually the last major landmass to have humans call it home. To give you some perspective on how isolated this place was, before humans arrived in New Zealand, these islands didn't even have native terrestrial mammals, aside from some rare bats that could fly. The only native mammals on the islands could either swim like seals or fly like bats. New Zealand was stuck in the age of dinosaurs, or dinosaur ancestors, namely the birds. It wasn't until the Middle Ages when humans first arrived. The Romans, Han Dynasty, the Mongols all rose and fell before a single human arrived on New Zealand's shores, at least as far as we have evidence for. The first people were the Maori, a Polynesian people that had origins in East Asia and Taiwan and spread across the Pacific, reaching as far as New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island, with astonishing navigation skills and sailing skills. In sharp contrast to the tropical islands of the Pacific, the Maori adapted to this temperate climate, developing a fierce warrior culture, oftentimes based on ritualistic, sporadic episodes of violent clashes between various tribes, as no unified Maori state existed, and you can see this in the rugby players haka today. This changed when Europeans arrived. The Dutch would explore the region first, but it wasn't until Captain Cook under the British Crown came along with various other British maritimers that you started to see European settlements. But the British would trade firearms to the Maori in exchange for various other goods. This led to various Maori tribes being able to conquer others due to their superior technology coming from the Europeans. This, along with disease, led to a decrease in the native population. Various people groups from various parts of the British Isles tended to locate themselves in various areas around New Zealand. For example, the Scottish moved to the South Island. Even some American whalers settled in certain areas. Much of the Maori population settled and adopted Christianity. In 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the British and Maori chiefs, bringing the islands into the empire formally, and supposedly giving the native populations the same rights as others in the empire, but in practice, this was not the case, and land disputes arose oftentimes with violence during the New Zealand Wars. And forgive me for my terrible Maori pronunciation of that treaty, or of any word in that language I attempt to pronounce. Over the course of the rest of the 1800s and early 20th century, nearly all land, legal, and political power was handed over to the British, or Pakeha, as they're called, and I am mispronouncing again. It's rather interesting that this is the one country where the European population actually calls themselves by the name of the indigenous people groups. Granted, as scummy as this was, New Zealand had a better track record with its indigenous people than nearly every other settler colonial state, in sharp contrast to far worse oppression of native peoples that was seen in Australia. New Zealand was also the first country in the world to grant women the right to vote. New Zealand became a dominion of the British Empire in 1907, giving it some autonomy. A few years later, World War I broke out, and New Zealand, along with Australia, would fight under their own nation's flags for the first time. And this was a colossal nation-building moment. Most notably at the failed yet romanticized Anzac offensive against the Ottoman Turks during the Battle of Gallipoli. These very young nations, Australia and New Zealand, fought so hard that Ataturk, one of the commanders of the enemy Turkish side who would later become the founder of the modern Turkish state and its most important modern historical figure, said that, at least allegedly, quote, "Those heroes that have shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets. To us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent your sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." The Battle of Gallipoli was a military disaster for New Zealand, but a victory for the young nation's imagination. Due to the death toll, New Zealand wanted to get some more independence from the British, and nonetheless did get some, but at the same time it came out in support of the British Empire in World War II in the Pacific and the North African theaters. Maori soldiers also fought in their own battalions. Rommel, the most famous German general in the North African theater, said, "Give me a Maori battalion and I will conquer the world." In the aftermath of the war, the country developed a stronger social safety net than had already been put in place during the Great Depression. And during the 60s, many Maori had seen the efforts of African Americans and started their own protest movement, as many moved to the larger urban areas and came into positions of political power and demanded equal rights that they were denied of under that aforementioned treaty. During World War II, it had also become closer to the United States due to defense purposes, and it was anti-communist during the Cold War, fighting during the Korean War, and far more controversially during Vietnam. It also joined the Five Eyes intelligence program to coordinate intelligence gatherings with other Anglophone nations such as the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK. Like many nations during the 1980s, the nation also shifted to the right on economic matters, promoting free trade and deregulation after an economic crisis during the 1970s. And now we reach the world of today. New Zealand could be called a middle power. It has a strong economy and strong institutions, yet it also has a small population and very limited political influence outside of a small handful of tiny isolated Pacific Island nations. Its economy is highly developed and combines capitalism with a strong welfare state. It also has a high GDP per capita and a high human development index with a strong service sector, most notably in tourism, as well as a sizable manufacturing sector related to goods made from metal and lumber. However, its agricultural industry is its most well known. The kiwi fruit, funny enough, is not actually from New Zealand, but is actually the Chinese gooseberry that New Zealanders marketed as their own, cultivated and exported in mass. The country also produces a lot of wine, and most of all meat, namely lamb. The golden fields of the Southern Island are almost perfect for raising livestock. However, the isolation of these islands makes, number one, costs of freight very expensive to import and export goods, and furthermore, in particular in regards to agriculture, makes biosecurity an issue, as foreign diseases against crops and livestock can have devastating consequences for their agricultural sector, which is why they have very strict laws when it comes to bringing in produce. I remember that I was nearly charged $400 for bringing in a banana. 400 New Zealand dollars, that is. The country has also attracted immigrants, mainly from the Pacific Island nations and East Asia, which have complicated the bicultural makeup of the white Maori relationship to some degree, but in many cases also become a more rich, interesting country as a result. The economy, by and large, has also been swayed by global factors, such as the influence of the British Empire during the 1800s, that basically morphed it into a resource-based economy for exports to the rest of the British Empire, the Great Depression, the post-war economic boom and expansion of social democracy, the bust of the 1970s, the conservative pro-business Rogernomics in the 1980s, which in many ways emulated the Reaganomics in the United States under Ronald Reagan, and then the opening up of global free trade during the end of the Cold War, namely with China. These trends show that New Zealand lacks the power to move the world in any direction itself, yet managed to adapt to the changing circumstances pretty well. Speaking of external factors, let's move to foreign policy. The main regional power in Oceania is Australia. The two nations are very similar in their institutions, language, and culture, and are allies, with deeply interconnected sets of trade relations and even a free movement of labor. Granted, far more New Zealanders go to Australia than the other way around due to New Zealand's high cost of living and relative lower wages. While the two have a very strong bond, there is almost always bound to be some resentment from being the junior partner, and the two do make fun of each other a lot. The country is also a Western liberal democracy, which means it tends to align with other Western liberal democracies. During the early days, it followed the British Empire with some reservations, and today it mostly aligns with the United States, with some reservations, against military conflicts, most notably its opposition to nuclear weapons testing down in the Pacific, by otherwise allies like the United States and France. The country has also been involved in regional peacekeeping efforts in the Solomon Islands and East Timor. It also took part in US interventions in Yugoslavia and Afghanistan. Again, these have been either peacekeeping efforts spearheaded by the UN or multilateral military interventions led by the US and NATO, rather than New Zealand leading the way itself. The country also maintains strong trade relations with China, but does not align with China on a political basis as an autocratic regime, and it has also helped Ukraine with non-lethal military aid in its fight against Russia. Due to its isolation, New Zealand is safe from any real threat, and if there ever was a World War III that would break out, it would most likely either A, send support to its allies, the US and Australia, without direct military involvement, or some minor military involvement, unless the war came onto their doorstep, which is unlikely given their isolation. Again, isolation is a blessing and a curse. Given these factors, it's unlikely that New Zealand will ever be a great power, but hey, who needs power when you have Kiwis?